Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Prindle. And I read his book right here. It's all shiny. It's called The Politics of Glamour. And I think I read this book about 10 years ago. And when I was in high school and college, I was always involved in the student congress and, various politics in school. So when I read this book, it like really inspired me about the power of SAG-AFTRA and our union. And I really made me think, oh my God, like I don't even care about like being the president of the US. If I could be the president of SAG-AFTRA, I could make a lot of changes because it feels like a lot of what is set up in with our union can create waves throughout the nation. And we're always kind of at the forefront of things, and therefore it like is a powerful place to be. Because if this book is like such a great historical reference of the history of our union from the beginning to like the 70s. And it's just chock full of information. And on that note, maybe this is the great place for you to do your introduction for everybody.
I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I got a job with the University of Texas in 1976. And I found myself going back and forth to Los Angeles every summer and sometimes in the Christmas. And one day in 1981, I asked myself, I wonder if there's something I can study in Los Angeles that'll allow me to write off the costs on my taxes. And I thought, well, what would it be? Would it be aerospace? No, that's probably Washington, D.C. Well, what else is going on there? Hollywood. What about can I study something in Hollywood? And at the time, there was a big fight going on in the Screen Actors Guild between progressive unionists who were led by Ed Asner and conservative unionists who were led by Charlton Heston. And I had read some famous books on union politics earlier when I was a graduate student. And I thought, well, maybe I could study that. And so that was the beginning of what became that book you held in your hand. Tax avoidance.
Like any great project ever. Well, and I'm grateful for it because, obviously you're an educator and you're coming from it as a political scientist, like, overall, not like, it's not like, even though it says politics of glamour, it's not a glamorous book. It's actually like very educational. I was trying to reread it before our call. And I was like, oh, I forget like how educational and chock full it is. And so it's like, in essence, our blessing that you needed that tax write-off because, like it's a very educational academic study.
I'd like to talk about the industry because, of course, actors are in the industry and it helps to understand actors' politics, to understand the industry. So the first thing I'd like to tell your audience is that power in Hollywood is in the distribution wing of the industry. That is, we all think of the production wing because that's what we see. And we all see the exhibition wing because if you go to a theater, that's what you're doing. But the real power is in the people who distribute from the production wing to the exhibition wing. And you can make all the movies you want, but if you can't get them distributed to the customer, it doesn't matter. Therefore, the power has always been for 100 years and more in the distribution wing. The second thing is, I want everybody to know, is that the industry has been revolutionized every 20 to 30 years by new technology. That is, when sound came in 1927, it changed everything in Hollywood, including labor management relations. When television came in the late 1940s, it changed everything. Now, computers have come in and changed everything in Hollywood. And every time there's this new revolution in new types of technology, there's a new kind of conflict between labor and management. The arguments I hear now in the streets that you're making, Kim, I've heard before, or I read them in 1960 and 1948 and the 1930s. because the problem is still the same, that technology comes in and allows the people who are making and distributing entertainment to keep all the money. All right, the third thing is that the issue now, and the issue is usually, is residuals. Actors, and incidentally also writers, they find that they have their own, they have a performance. You say you make a movie in 1945, you make the movie, you got paid for it, and 5 years later you discover the movie's on television and you're not getting paid for it. So you go to the producers and distributors and you say, we want to be paid when that movie is shown again on television. And of course they say no. So then you have a strike. What you don't have the strike right then, you wait until you're really mad in 1960, and then you have a really big strike. And you have another really big strike in 1980 when there's a cable television. And the writers have a huge strike, a 5-month bitter strike in 1988, which is also over residuals from the new technology. So those are three things we always have to keep in mind. Powers in distribution. The conflict is almost always over residuals or residuals and something else. Now it's over residuals and AI, which is another new technology. And the industry keeps getting revolutionized by technological change, which causes economic change, which causes conflict between management and labor. That's my intro.
Wow, that is so informative. So, I would say that with the streaming, that's kind of like, it's almost like there's two new technologies we're dealing with.
Yes,
streaming as well
time.
as AI. So, and we're late to the game on the streaming, being that with the Netflix and Hulu, whenever they came about, I know that those contracts, as an actor, I know that those contracts were made favorably for those production companies in order to allow them the opportunity to grow. But now it's kind of become the new technology. Like, everybody's watching Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, but they're also the producers in some ways, right? Because they're paying for the production of it. So does that mean that at this point with them, the distribution and the producers are the same people?
In Hollywood, there's always this tendency to what economists call vertical integration. If you're a producer, you want the distribution, you want the exhibition. If you own a chain of theaters, you want to go backwards through distribution to production. And yes, there are independents, as Robert Redford has taught everyone, but the industry is dominated by these huge vertically integrated companies because the huge vertically integrated companies control distribution.
Well, isn't that aren't there laws against monopolies in our country?
Yes, but of course they always have to be enforced. And sometimes they are enforced and sometimes they're not. It depends on who's in power. In 1948 or 49, in the Paramount Decree, the Supreme Court told these studios, you are illegal according to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. You have to sell your theater chains. But it took a lawsuit of more than 10 years to finally get that Paramount Decree to be made. And before that time, the studios were supreme.
Well, I think that they're supreme again, it feels like.
And because now they're not just studios, they're not just making movies, they're not just television. Now they're computer companies too, which is a new distribution system and also creates AI, which creates the second problem.
Right. Well, on that note with the AI, I was just from rereading like the beginning chapter of your book, and it was talking about how, stars, a lot of people don't understand with the strikes that like it's not really the stars that you see. They're not the ones that are like upset. It's they're striking for the little guys like myself, the lower echelon, because the stars already can negotiate a lot of things on their own just for their face. And one of those things was creative, control, like a little bit of creative input, meaning that let's say that, the script said you were supposed to do something that you didn't feel was morally, against your own morals. You could say no and ask them to kind of work around that. But if they scan us and start doing AI and they do the scripts as AI, we're almost getting rid of the human element of what stories are being told. Now there's going to be no human filters for which that is coming through, which kind of gives total control to the people that have the money and distribution and producing to put out whatever stories they want to put out.
As we all saw in the latest iteration of the Star Wars films, AI brought a dead actor back to life. Peter Cushing, who was in the original story as a villain, he got killed in the explosion of the Death Star on film, but then a few years later, he actually died. And yet in the new trilogy of Star Wars, there was Peter Cushing talking to the new equivalent of Darth Vader, even though the guy was dead, but they did it with AI. And if they can do that with Peter Cushing, they can do it with anybody. Now, I assume that Peter Cushing's estate got some residuals from that performance by a dead person, although I don't actually know it, I just assume it. But
Right.
Here you are, and as you said in your news clip, you've now been turned into an AI, even though you're still alive.
That's great.
And of course, the producers and distributors would love to be able to put you into a scene without actually paying you anything.
Mm-hmm.
And you, a lone person, don't have very much power to push back. But when you combine in the power of a union, you have a great deal of power. So what's happening now in 2023 is that these two crises caused by technology, the lack of residuals because of streaming and the lack of personal integrity because of AI, the artists have now said, well, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore.
Yeah, we're taking the streets, and literally, and to be sort of like a small player in the industry so long, to feel the opportunity to finally be upset about the things that have kind of been slowly upsetting us, like not getting residuals has affected me. I was in a contract, I should have been upgraded to principal, but the union was like, well, there's no need for us to fight for you for this, because I was on such a high rate as a background, because it was a specialty that I wouldn't have got residuals anyway. So they were like, we're just not going to even fight for it, So these are aspects that affect the little guys that are, like you said, we built up to the point of like, we're really angry. So then my question for you is like, do you see any resolution? Like, I mean, how do we tell the producers you can't scan people? And, I mean, how do we force Netflix to start giving us residuals?
I've just, by the way, I wrote another book called Risky Business, The Political Economy of Hollywood, which came out in 1993. And I tell the story of the 1988 writers' strike. The parallels between the writers' strike in 88 and these strikes this year are remarkable, in that the capitalists had decided to dig in and not give anything to the unions, and the unions had decided the same thing. The strike was utterly brutal. It went on for 5 months. I mean, when everything shuts down in Hollywood, it's not just the actors and the producers and the writers, it's the caterers and it's the cab drivers, and it's everybody who depends upon an industry for a livelihood. And by the end of the 4th month in 1988, people were writing letters to the Hollywood Reporter and Variety saying, we can't do this anymore. We've got to, we're killing ourselves. We're committing suicide. And it seems to me that the atmosphere in Hollywood is right now very similar to 1988 in that both labor and management went into it intending to be tough and to stand their ground and to win. But now that the caterers have shut down and there's no more Uber drivers and you can't get scripts typed or whatever it is done now, the whole town is gasping and saying this we're committing suicide. We have to change things. So I think that's what's going to happen is that it's going to go on for another 3 weeks or a month. And finally, there will be a compromise. And that not only will there be a compromise, but new institutions will come into effect so that labor and management can consult before they get to the strike point. That's what they did in 1988. But, you know, a generation and a half went by and everybody forgot about it. Now they're having to learn the lesson painfully again.
Do you think that there should be like a residual system for actors that are like, if they,
of course.
I feel like we can't say no to scanning, you know, like it's useful, like in terms of what you mentioned, someone's past, or say there's a stunt that's unsafe for any stunt person to actually do, like use the scan and CGI it, right?
Well, the way things have worked out in the past, if I can take lessons learned from the past and bring them to 2023, what will happen is that SAG-AFTRA will make as one of its demands, you can't record an actor without written permission. And they'll fight over that and argue. And in the end, SAG will yield and allow actors to be recorded for AI purposes, but they'll get a guarantee of payment, of a payment that matters. So, what's happened in the past is that the actors union has demanded more control over the work and in the end has compromised for more money. Whether that will happen again, I can't say for sure, but that's the pattern in the past.
There's a part of me that wonders if there's a slightly bigger picture with this, and that is, why are people's likenesses like a free-for-all? For example, if you record my voice and you use it in a song and you make money off that song, you owe me money. But if you take a picture of me and make t-shirts and sell 1 million of them, you owe me nothing. Like, why does my likeness have no rights? And is that something we should look at?
There's actually an answer to that question. And the answer to the question is why you are paid for your voice is because the musicians union became very powerful in the 1930s and 40s, was run by some very hardball people, quasi gangsters, and they essentially got the rights to the human voice written into all contracts starting in the 1940s, I think it was. Somebody needs to do now is do the same thing for images.
I concur. Then that would be like, do I need to contact senators? Is that like, how does that happen? Because it almost feels to me like this is a federal problem. Like this isn't, this is more than just what's going on in the union. Because if SAG-AFTRA makes like agreements with the producers, right? And they're like, okay, so you owe 0.02% for every union actor you scan, blah, 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 right? Then I feel that the producers are just going to go to Oklahoma, where it's a right to work straight, go to the mall and like put up a sign and start scanning people for $25 or whatever to be in the movies. Like the only way to actually stop this is to create some kind of law change or whatever.
Well, there's two ways. One is at the bottom with the union itself exerting pressure, and the other is at the top through representatives in Congress. But of course, when you're doing representatives in Congress, you've got the producers who have their representatives in Congress too. And I've written lots of books on how that works.
Well,
and
yeah,
how
I
it
need to
turns
read
out.
more of your books. I didn't know you had another one, because I was lamenting that it ended in the 70s, this one, So I'm excited to hear that there's more. 'Cause I came to Los Angeles in 2000, and that was like at the end of a strike that led into reality TV,
Yes.
and that affected me.
That was about commercials, wasn't it?
That
The
I don't
2000
know.
strike. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've had multiple strikes, and commercials we've completely lost, as a union. They're almost all non-union. Did you know that?
No,
Yeah.
I went away to other topics.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, within the last like 5 years or so, all the commercials have gone non-union. Maybe we should talk about the streaming residuals, because we kind of touched on AI. And I think I agree with you on AI, that there somehow it's got to be some kind of complex residual system.
All I can say is that the pattern is you control distribution, and this is a new kind of distribution, and you keep the residuals to yourself until the actors make you give them more.
And a lot of times in your book, like it did come to it seemed like it came to blows, right? Like you mentioned the quasi mobsters. And my friend Megan, who actually made me call you, she's from Chicago, her family, and her granddad was a musician. So she always has told me that as well, so, is that what it's going to take? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I could give you another series of lectures on the American political system and how we're broken up into 50 states. And there's been fights for more than 200 years about the authority of the federal government versus the authority of the states. But I think that's not what you do.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I should have my own podcast.
You should. I mean, you have so much information to give. I'm totally in support of that. Well, so what about, would you like to talk some more about like the streaming residuals? I don't know that they're showing that there's been like double profits for Netflix, Hulu, everyone's getting it, but yet there's no residuals. Anything you see for that resolution?
It's all part of the same fight over how much of the new revenue from the new distribution system goes to the actors and how much is kept by the business.
For example, social media. Part of me wonders, I was sitting there at the strike and I was thinking, is this basically the end of the system as we know it? Is it going to just become everyone has their own podcast, everyone has their own website, everyone's their own streamer, everyone's only on Instagram? We don't a lot of people don't even, they just watch YouTube, a lot of people do that. Isn't the only way out of this is for the actors to become the distributors and the producers?
What an interesting thought. If you could do that, I'd write another book.
Well, I better hurry up and get it done then. Let's make this happen.
Well, the fact is, I'm not on social media. I'm a 20th century mind, and I'm happy to stay there. And this is my first experience with an interview like this. You're the first influencer I've ever met.
It's funny. I'm part of the Next Gen program for SAG-AFTRA.
Right. I'm a member of the dying gen. So, or the Social Security gen is actually a better.
Yeah, looking forward to that. And that's interesting as an actor. Because I was actually a musician before. I sang with the band George Clinton, traveled all over the world, and then I joined AFTRA through that. And then I actually was SAG eligible, but I joined the union when they became one. And as a former musician, when I started working as an actor, I was like, wait, I get pension, I get insurance, there's all these protections, so it's interesting. I always thought of musicians as having no protections until this whole scanning likeness versus voice came into play. And I was like, oh, well, maybe actually when it comes to matter, musicians have more protection.
I think you're giving your opinion here, and I'm not in disagreement.
Yeah, but why do you think that musicians, what happened to the musicians union and their power, and there's no pension, and there's no, musicians' raises have not raised?
Oh, that's another book, and I don't know the answer.
You're I'd have to research to write that book. Right?
I didn't write a book on the musicians, but working with Hollywood, I learned a little bit about the history of the musician. I had to, but it's a different union, which is national, not concentrated in a way that Hollywood has always been concentrated. And now we've come to the end of my expertise.
Yeah, well, the final fight, of course, that we're having is quite simple, and that's the pay increase to reflect the cost of living. They originally asked for 20%, and they said no. And then I think they asked for 11, and then they responded with 4% increase. And, for me, when I do background, when I first moved to Los Angeles back in 2000, backgrounds got paid twice, union versus non-union. So non-union set on minimum wage, and then background would get twice that. And now it's almost the same. In fact, some cases in some of the streaming contracts, union background gets paid lower than minimum wage. And then the state corrects it when they send you the check.
I think it's worth bringing up again a point that you made a little bit in the past, which is that the contracts that SAG-AFTRA negotiates is for the basic working non-star actor. The stars have their agents negotiate separate contracts. And so the stars really don't need protection from the contract. What SAG is striking for now is for the people who are not stars, which is the great majority of membership. And in the history of SAG, there's always been a problem because a lot of those stars also tend to be producers. That's where the big money is. You don't just star in a movie, you also have a production cut, points, as the people inside say. And that contract is a separate contract. It's not the one that the union has negotiated. So when there's a strike, or when there's a tendency to, or a choice about a strike, the people who are actor producers, they're called hyphenates. Those people are under conflict of interest, because when the actors are complaining that they're not getting enough money for their work, some of the actors, producers, see it as the working actor sees it. But some of them sees it as management sees it. And they will often argue within the guild itself, sometimes at guild meeting, we shouldn't be striking, this is foolish, we're losing money. They are speaking as actors, but they may be thinking as producers. And this is a problem that most unions don't have. The truckers union, or the electricians union, or the carpenters union, they don't have a problem with hyphenate. They don't have these superstars who look at things from management's point of view. So it's the artistic unions always have this problem that they're asking the most successful members of their profession to support the just ordinary workers. And some people are ideological progressives. Ed Asner comes to mind. Even though they're hugely successful and very rich, they would support whatever was in the best interest of the working actor. But some producers, and this is true in the Writers Guild too, that when they're thinking about a strike, the stars say, wait a minute, this is not a good thing to do.
That's a really good point. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. And our last president, for the last time that these contracts were up, she was also producing, like, it was The Girl from Beverly Hills 90210, and she was producing a movie about Beverly Hills at the same time she became the president. And there were a lot of people that thought she should be taken out of the presidency.
Now wait a minute. One of the first bylaws that the Guild adopted in the 1930s was that no officer or nobody on the board could have production interest.
That's correct. I think then this was like a big conflict. And I think that I don't know how she stayed in. Maybe it's because her show was only on Netflix, so it was an only streaming movie.
It's well, here we're both trying to imagine what it was like, but I don't know what it was like, but there must have been some legal loophole allowed her to be both production and actor, and I can't
And
think of her
still
name.
be president. I question because she's the one that, signed the current contracts we're under. So it's like, that's the example of why it's important we don't have people who are hyphenate, which is tricky, because like in some ways I'm a hyphenate because I do my own social media. I produce
That's
it.
true. That's a good point. I wonder what they're going to do about that.
Right. Like, and right now they have a program with social media. I actually had my insurance and pension point from social media where I paid into it as a producer. So the contracts I got on social media, I then turned them into the union and gave myself a percentage of the money that I made as the actor. And then I paid my pension as the producer myself and got my pension. That's a new program they have.
Well, I foresee that this is going to be an issue in the future. It's
I think you're
probably
right.
not an issue now because there's not a lot of money in it.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember about 1970 when Charlton Heston was on the board of the Guild. He had no production interest, never did. But his son, Fraser Heston, produced a movie in which his father starred. The Mountain Man, it was called. And there was a lot of grumbling in the Guild that this was a way to get around the rule through nepotism.
Yeah.
And personally, I mean, I knew Heston. I think he was an honorable person. And I doubt very much if he took any of his son's money except the actor's fee. But that's not the point. The point is that if you have a relative, you can make an end run around the rule that says you can't have production and
Right.
be in the Guild leadership.
Right. More loopholes. And I mean, and it is tricky because like we said, like we're artists. So why wouldn't we want to also produce? We might just want to do that. For me, who sees myself maybe in the future being in leadership, like the idea that I couldn't be a producer is kind of upsetting, right? Like that's why I bring it up with the social media. Like, are they going to say, oh, well, social media people can't be in leadership because they are producers? And at the same time, I also understand the importance of it. And I feel I'm personally seeing it reflected or wondering if I'm seeing it reflected on what we're dealing with now, which I think a lot of it is, like you said, it's a new technology. And that's where in Los Angeles, the union that we have has such an opportunity consistently, historically, to make waves because we're always at the forefront of technology.
If I were to wish you good wishes, I would say, may you become successful enough to be a hyphenate and be under a conflict of interest and become the enemy.
Right. Right. Actually, you're right. That's sort of the best way to infiltrate, isn't it? Yeah. You talked at the end of this book, you talked about how a lot of times the people that were leftists came from theater and TV, and the people that were progressives were movie. And
yeah, it's not 100%, but yeah, there was a tendency there. Yeah, this, of course, this is 40 years ago, but the people who were the progressives in the union tended to be oriented towards the stage. And their first love tended to be the stage. And the people who were who tended to be more conservative were oriented towards movies. And they were more interested in making films than many of them didn't care about being on the stage. I was interviewing a conservative at the time. His name was Dick Bacallion. And you probably don't remember his name, but if you look him up in some database, you'll see that he was a short guy with a broken nose who almost always played the villain's henchman. And he was a conservative. And, I would ask a question of everybody. I had a series of questions. And one of them was, other things being such as money being equal, would you rather work on the stage, in the movies, or on television? And overwhelmingly, the progressives would say, I would rather work on the stage. And when I asked Dick Bacallion other things such as money being equal, would you rather work on the stage or movies or TV? He said, that question doesn't make any sense. What do you mean other things such as money being equal? I do it for the money. You can't take money out of the equation. That's why I'm an actor. Whereas no progressive would have said that.
Well, absolutely. That's kind of why I brought up about the scans and like the creative control aspect, because that there are a lot of artists, myself being one, and I come from my boss was George Clinton. I don't know if you know that person, George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic. It's an African-American band from the 70s. He was a bit revolutionary with his words and music. And so some of us are like artists because we want to tell stories, right? And I think that some of us are artists because they want money, perhaps, I guess, right? And so
and as we know, they're not really artists.
Right, exactly. In truth, exactly. And I think that if we become this, like, we're scanned and then the scripts are written with AI and then all of the motions done with AI. And so now those of us like myself that are here to tell stories, there's no reason anymore to even be a part. They're getting rid of us, and we're also the left, which tends to be problematic, right?
I think that is the ultimate existential fear, is that the industry has always suffered artists just because it needed them. And the fear is that the industry will now be able to say, we don't need artists anymore. Now, personally, I think that's unlikely because you always need a spark of creativity. Otherwise, you don't make real entertainment. I mean, you think of the motion picture industry in the Soviet Union. All for 60 years, all their movies were propaganda. They had to be propaganda. There was one that had my favorite title, Boy Loves Girl Loves Trek. All those movies were terrible. And even the Russians didn't want to watch them because they were such awful films. And that was because they weren't art. They were formula. And they were political propaganda. Seems to me that if the corporate types think they can make entertainment that's simply formula, and so much formula, it can be done with an AI, they're going to discover that their audience has gone away. Is watching actresses who have podcasts.
Exactly, back to our own website. Well, I hope you're right. I do personally, this is like back to being a musician. Like I saw what happened whenever auto-tune took over, and like, I feel like they desensitized people's ears with music. And I'm wondering if that's the agenda with, but I guess you're making a good point. They tried for what, decades in Russia, and they didn't desensitize their senses.
Yes, there's also the problem that, I started reading scholarly discussions of Hollywood that went back to the 1930s. And at least as far back as the 1930s, there are laments by scholars saying, oh, they could have made great art, but they made all this schlock.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous book by an anthropologist named Hortense Powdermaker. What a wonderful name. And the book is Hollywood, the Dream Factory from the 1940s. And it's all about how Hollywood had the chance to make great entertainment, but didn't. And all Hollywood movies are just terrible. And you hear that all the way through. So the question is it finally going to come true that there's going to be nothing but machine-made schlock?
That's the question, isn't it?
And the answer is, when my students used to ask me questions about the future, like who's going to win the next election or something, I would always answer, if I could foretell the future, I would not be here. I would be at the racetrack.
So you don't know for sure if.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The main theme of my second book, Risky Business, is basically about fear and insecurity and risk. and how it's so hard to be in Hollywood because there's always this existential fear. Now, me, I had tenure, so I was one of those people who wasn't in the industry, who had a secure job. But whenever I went to Hollywood and talked to people, I could hear, even in some of the great stars, some of the fear of unemployment. Charlton Heston, in fact, once said to me, every job I've ever had, when it ended, I thought I'd never work again. I thought that was it. It's over. My career has ended. And I could, even though he's the only one who actually said that, I could feel that Hollywood is a place where people are always fearful of the future.
And I think that's something that like people don't understand when they see us striking. They're like, oh, you guys make so much money. And I remember when I was a kid, I would see someone on TV. This woman came to my small hometown and did like a workshop. And I was thinking like, oh, well, if you were on that TV show once, like, why are you here? I see that TV show over and over again. There's not an understanding that we don't have. Like when there's people that come on set from like other jobs that like just for some reason got cast for this show, they're always appalled at the way we are treated, how long our hours are, how we, no one understands that even Charlton Heston has to worry about the next job. We don't like other people. That's why we have to have residuals. Because
exactly, that's what residuals are for. It's for an actual career as opposed to the gig economy. And in fact, I've read some stuff by modern economists saying that the whole economy of the United States is moving towards the gig economy. When I was at UCLA in 1970, I was working my way through college, and I was a cab driver. Summer of 1970, yellow cab company. I drove a Ford LTD, which was about 100 feet long. And all summer, I was a cab driver. Now, there are hardly any cab drivers left. It's all
Uber.
And those people are a member of the gig economy, whereas I had a contract and a steady job. And I understand the concern that steady jobs are going away. My son is 38 years old, and he's a novelist. And he's written a novel that's really good, but he's never, or at least not in the near future, going to have anything like a steady income. And that's the difference partly between his era and my era.
That's the painful thing that my generation is dealing with. And it feels like few people can see, like you can see it, but it feels like most of the older generation is just like, oh, like, why haven't you bought a house yet? And just get over it. And,
Wow, this is like conversation I used to have in Hollywood 30 years ago.
Really?
Saying, I'm so afraid.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I was there interviewing, I was this pretty young guy who was a college professor from Texas. I had absolutely no connections. I interviewed people, not just actors, but writers and even some executives who asked me if I could find them a job. And their thinking was, this guy's talking to people who hire. So maybe if they would mention me. And when they would say something like this to me, I'd think, these people live in a paranoid fantasy world. And I was sympathetic to them because I wasn't like that.
Well, I wonder if the producers and the distributors can perpetuate a situation where we live in that paranoia so that we will jump as high as they tell the monkey to jump, and we'll be more compliant.
And the answer is, I hope for you that's not the case. But you chose a profession that doesn't have tenure.
Right.
And so you have to make an adventure of the insecurity.
Yeah, I suppose historically that's the part of the path of an actor, no matter how big or small you are. Well, I don't know. I so appreciative to get to talk to you. You're just a wealth of knowledge, and we're so lucky that you had any interest in Hollywood. And I mean, like I said, I kind of think you know, you brought up when we were talking about, well, how do we protect the likenesses of people? And I actually did an interview with Rolling Stone and mentioned that, you know, and she shook her head yes. And I was kind of surprised that like other people in the press might agree, like about there being some kind of ownership to a person's likeness. And I think it's interesting that you said like, well, you can do it from the top with like your senator, representative, Congress people, or you can do it from the bottom like we're doing in the union right now. And I think most people think of us as the top, you know, like, oh, SAG aftra strike. Like it's like, but really we're just like your plumbers, like, you know, and yes, we're hammering away at like a big thing, but we really are the bottom. We're the bottom up trying to fix this problem.
I want to leave you with the thought that I hope you win an Oscar.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope my son wins the Pulitzer Prize.
Me too. Me too. I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And I'm glad he took after you with writing because, you know, you clearly, when you read your book, it is academic, but anyone could read it. Like you have a way of, you're an entertainer yourself, I guess.
That's why I won all those teaching awards.
But there you go. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Prindle. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And maybe we can do this again in a couple of years.
Okay. Hopefully we'll see how this strike ends and then we'll stay in touch.
Please do.